Hi, Tara. Thanks so much for joining. And thank you to everyone who's joining on YouTube Live. We're really excited for today's conversation, which is about what to expect from your first software engineering job and like those first 90 days at a big tech company like Google. This is a really unique perspective because Tara graduated just a few years ago in 2016 from Brown. And during her time at Brown, was an intern at Google in software engineering, and then became a software engineer and also worked at the Moonshot Factory. And so with that sort of fresh perspective, I'm really excited to hear about sort of best practices, how you ended up there, and then how students like us can sort of aspire to do the same. And with that, Tara, welcome. It's great to have you, and thanks for spending time with us today.
Awesome. Great to be here. So yeah, as James just mentioned, I'm going to be talking about what to expect from your first software engineering job. I am just going to start with a little bit about me. So, and then I'll go into what is a software engineer, what does a software engineer do day to day, give you a walkthrough of the first 60 to 90 days on the job, and then talk you through some things I learned along the way. So about me, who are you talking to today? I studied computational biology at Brown because I was really interested in biology and computer science and wanted to kind of blend the two. Ooh, sorry, my throat is doing some weird things. I was also a teaching assistant during my time in college for a couple different classes, also worked at the Children's Hospital, was involved in the entrepreneurship program, went and became a software engineer at Google. And during my time there, over 4 years, I was in a bunch of different teams. So display ads, infrastructure, the next billion users, or kind of emerging markets team. I was also the chapter lead for Google Women in Engineering for the Bay Area. And then eventually I switched over to X to work on some more research type projects. I also, and this is going to become a theme later in the presentation, but I'm also involved in just a ton of things outside of work. I am the type of person who needs a lot of variety in my life. So I also teach, I read a lot, I invest in Robinhood. I am a really novice piano player, like to experiment with cooking, and do a couple of nonprofits outside of work as well. So I wanted to start today and just talk about what is a software engineer. A software engineer is a person that applies the principles of computer science to the design, development, maintenance, testing, and evaluation of computer software. What does that mean? It's really like when you're in college, you learn the computer science, the theory, right, of everything in the field. But when you're a software engineer, you take that theory that you've learned in school and you apply it to a bunch of different stages of the software development lifecycle. It's still very analytical and object-oriented, and there's still a lot of programming and algorithm development, but it's not, it's kind of a very applied version of the classes that you're probably used to. Who is a software engineer? I just wanted to take a pause and step back and talk a little bit about who ends up, working at these big tech companies or founding startups of their own. The amazing thing about this new young pool of talent is that it's more diverse than ever before. And I have talked to a couple of different startups who, really want to hire women, really want to hire Black people and people of color. But they're finding it really hard to do that on a senior level. But what's giving them hope is they're looking at this new pool of talent and that's, coming from all of your classes, and they're thinking, oh my God, like there's kind of this big change coming and we're really excited to be able to hire from that pool. I also wanted to say here that a software engineer doesn't always have the same background, like the kind of traditional background. Not all of them study computer science in college and then become software engineers straight out of college. Some of them don't study CS in college at all. Some of them don't go to college at all. some of the best engineers that I've worked with at Google came from these kind of non-traditional backgrounds. And so if you're someone that started CS late, or if you're someone who's like already majoring in something completely different, or thinking of not going to college at all, and you're asking yourself, like, can you still become a software engineer? The answer is yes. And I'm happy to talk about that more at the end of the presentation in the Q&A section. All right, so what does a software engineer do day to day? Because I actually had a lot of questions about this. Like, I didn't really know, even though I, interned at Google before I worked there, I didn't really know what I was signing up for because I didn't have a really good grasp on what software engineers do day to day. In my head, it was just like sit at your desk and code all day, but that's not actually what it looks like. A software engineer, designs new systems and implements new features for sure. But part of the job is also learning new languages and APIs and frameworks that are out there in the ecosystem. You also, have to fix bugs and maintain code, which I think is the less sexy part of being a software engineer. And obviously test code, not only like unit test your code, but also kind of test your code like in the larger system where it exists. Sometimes you pair program. Sometimes you like mentor a new person who joins the team. Sometimes you review, not sometimes, a lot of the times you're reviewing teammates' code. You definitely collaborate with product managers and designers and other engineers. You are also responsible for the management of project work within smaller sprint cycles. So not every organization uses, like, if you've heard of the sprint framework or the agile framework, not every organization uses that, but there's always some sort of way of tracking what's happening. And it's your job to kind of do some of that project management yourself. And then you also need to keep up to date on the frameworks and libraries and sort of larger trends in the industry to make sure that what you're building is the right thing. Oh, and obviously, there's a whole host of other things, but these were, and they sort of will also shift based on where you are in your career. So I like to kind of think of jobs as having, having a bunch of different categories of work underneath them. And every job is sort of a different distribution across those buckets of work. So when you first start out, you're going to be pretty heavy on the design new systems, implement new features, fix bugs bucket. But as you grow over time, the implementation of new features bucket is probably going to shrink. The designing new systems bucket is probably going to grow. The pair programming is probably going to grow. The reviewing of teammates' code is probably going to grow. So it's pretty dynamic. The kind of, just because when you start out, you're coding 50% of the time or 70% of the time doesn't mean that it's always going to stay that way. Okay, so to give you more of an idea of kind of, to kind of allow yourself to visualize yourself doing this, I'm just gonna go through the first 90 days on the job. So you got the job, now what happens? This is exactly how I felt when we took this picture, is my first week at Google with my Xoogler orientation, and now my life friends. They actually just celebrated their 4-year work anniversary earlier this month, so big shout out to them. So you got the job, now what? So week 1, there's a lot of orientation. You got to learn the internal tools, do some paperwork, learn what your benefits are. You also should definitely seek out mentors if they're not already given to you. And I really advise having one technical mentor and one non-technical mentor. The technical mentor is going to be there for your sort of everyday questions. And your non-technical mentor is kind of going to be your fairy godmother at the office, almost someone who can give you more context about the team, but is also just a buddy who's there for you. You kind of related to both of those pieces, should definitely ask someone to tell you the history of the team, and ask the second newest person for an overview of the system architecture. And then it's also, no one will tell you to do this, but it's also a really good idea to document things as you go. So teams and companies always or typically have, internal documentation that they'll hand to you when you first get there. And the constant refrain is that documentation is always out of date. And so if you can help make it up to date as you go, that's going to be a huge help to your team. So definitely do that. And then the kind of asking someone to tell you a history of the team is really key, just to give you context for where they are, where they came from, where they are right now, and a little bit about what the goals are. So in week 2, you can start to do the following. So set up regular one-on-ones with your manager for sure, and you should come with an agenda. There should be a goal, like something that you want to get from your manager, or something that you want your manager to get from you by the end of the conversation. This is like a skill that you build up over time. Like I remember sitting in my first one-on-one and just having zero idea what I could possibly want or need from my manager. And then it sort of, you sort of like see these patterns along the way from talking to your teammates about what you should be asking for. So scope out where the next thing is like scoping out where you sit in relation to the team and the company's goals. And this is what the history of the team is going to start to give you. You should definitely, like, sort of skipping down, like ask questions as soon as you're stuck on something for more than 15 minutes. Ask questions as soon as you think that something doesn't make sense, and challenge assumptions. So everyone, it's sort of hard once you're in a job for a long time to see the things that don't make sense, but you, as sort of with this fresh perspective, are going to be able to say like, hey, that doesn't make sense. Like, why, if you were doing something 5 years ago and it didn't work, why are you still doing it now? And sort of like be okay, be comfortable with being that voice in the room. And then one really like practical thing that you can start doing in week 2 is fix quick bugs that are on the backlog. Figure out where the team keeps their sort of backlog pile of tasks, and just pick out some ones that look really easy, like refactoring code, or updating to new library, or fixing an import statement, or removing to-do statements. Like, these are all things that are necessary for the health and cleanliness of the code, but that, once you're in the thick of things, you just won't have time to go back and do. This is a really easy way of getting familiar with the code base, submitting your first few pieces of code. And if you keep doing this, it's actually a really easy way to like become like, a really effective contributor to the team. All right, then weeks 3 through 8 start, and this is like where the magic happens. So you start taking on a larger project during these weeks. This project is something that typically you choose from something that from either what you're hearing from your manager or your teammates. And make sure that you pick something that's aligned with the team and the company's goals, which is why in sort of weeks 1 and 2, you figure out what those are. They should be aligned to your skills and your strengths, aligned to your personal and professional goals. And they kind of, from a kind of collaborations perspective, they should provide exposure to and the opportunity to collaborate with people who are sort of giving you good vibes in that first 2 weeks. And then once you have the project or the problem that you're working on, you want to research the problem, make sure it has buy-in from stakeholders, research and experiment with solutions, write a technical design document. You're going to get that design document reviewed. The technical design document, like the format of it, is typically based on what the company likes doing. So at Google, we had sort of a template that everyone followed, but other companies, you can look at what people have done before to see the types of considerations that people are thinking about. Once you have that design document, you get the document reviewed. And once you get the all clear, you start implementing the solution. This is what will take, like this will take you to the end of month 1 or month 2 typically. You want to pick something that's like large enough in scope to have a real impact, but not so large that it takes you like 5 months to get through it. And after that, it's sort of like rinse and repeat. You can either increase the scope of the project that you already started. You can explore new problem spaces. Just make sure it keeps increasing your scope again and again to kind of impact more of the team, more users, etc. All right, so things I learned the hard way. And so the first kind of harks back to what I said before about challenging assumptions and asking questions. You're never, never, never too new to contribute. So be proactive about helping your colleagues, doing good for your customers, challenging those assumptions, and then, related to the second one, ask questions as you go. The third that I learned the hard way was learning to set boundaries. It's really key to preventing burnout, especially when you're working from home. You need to just, have a clear separation between work time and home time. And give yourself the time to explore your other interests. For some people on my team, on previous teams that I've been on, for some people, their other interests were, doing their own coding project outside of work, or playing a bunch of video games. But for other people, it was, doing nonprofit work for me, or playing the piano, or, any number of things related or not to your, core day-to-day job. The fourth is it's okay to say no. I think at least I was the type of person when I got to my job, I thought that I always had to say yes to things. Like I thought when someone suggested something to me, that wasn't a suggestion, it was them telling me what to do. But in fact, there's a lot of autonomy that comes with software engineering jobs at big companies, and especially at small companies. And you've got to learn to strategically say yes to things and strategically say no to things, and know that it's okay if the answer is no. But you need to sort of, learn to give reasons for why that's not the right time for you to do something, or the right skill set for you, or the right, goal for the team. Other things I learned the hard way. So you've got to learn to manage your manager. I did not know how to do this when I first started. Like I said, I didn't even know what to ask for from my manager. And learning to do that learning to have like a really good working relationship with your manager will help them to sort of funnel you towards projects that are going to be interesting for you. And then also just, make your life a lot easier. The sixth one, this is like definitely something that I learned the hard way. Everyone's career trajectories are going to be different. So there's no, unlike school, there's no class curve. Like when I first started, was trying to calibrate myself against my peers. Like, were we all getting the same grades, or like the same performance review? Were we all submitting the same number of lines of code? Were we all, did we all have the same relationships with our managers? And the answer to all these things was no. Like, no one was getting the same number of lines of code in. No one had the same relationship with their managers, because, every team is different, and every project moves at a different pace. And I beat myself up really badly when I first started. I was like, I'm not working fast enough, or I'm not picking the right projects. And in reality, it all worked out in the end. And we all sort of prioritized work when we needed to prioritize work, and, non-work when that was what our sanity and our stage in life demanded. So yeah, everyone's trajectories are going to be different. The seventh one was, related to that, to the previous one, developing a strong sense of self. outside of a work context. To be more specific about this one, I found that when things were going, when things were tough at work, like when I had wrestled with a piece of code for 6 hours and it still wasn't working, or when I, when launches weren't going well, or whatever it was, when work wasn't going well, I found initially that my whole sense of self was sort of crumbling because I attached a lot of value to work. Like I needed work to be going well in order to feel good about myself. And over time, I was like, wait, hold on. Like I am so much like my identity, yes, is made out of, is what I do, but it's also a lot of other things that I know about myself to be true regardless of how work is going. And this might not make sense to you. Apologies if I sound like sort of your hipster aunt who's telling you to have a strong sense of self. But hopefully you'll remember this, when you're in your first job and think back to this talk and be like, yeah, she was right. And then the last one is just meet as many people as you can. If we were still working from work, my advice would be to never eat lunch alone. I don't know if, we'll ever go back to that kind of working style, but the point here being that like, it's really important to, to, again, get context for what's going on, have champions around the office who can help you, who can sort of, like sort of help amplify your voice if you need it, or help, guide you to speak to the right person if you need it. And make sure that those are, meaningful relationships, that those people like really want to stand up for you. I don't have a great way of doing this while working remotely. Like I think it's really tough to keep doing this while working remotely, but if there are things that you find that you need from your team when you first start, like definitely ask for that. So if you feel like you're isolated because you don't know anyone, ask for there to be a happy hour, or ask people to do one-on-ones with you and get to know the team. That is okay. I think I'll stop rambling now. That is all I had prepared. My last thing was just get in touch. Here's my email, my Twitter, and a link to my LinkedIn. I think we'll be sending these slides out at the end of this session. So get in touch if you have questions. Otherwise, it can be time for Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much, Tara. That was I really, really appreciated that. I think our students did as well. I'm going to open up, the door is opened up. So let me check in there for some Q&A, but I really liked sort of the best practices you were sharing and being honest and sort of learning from mistakes. So thank you for sort of opening up, and I'm sure that a lot of us will make the same mistakes, but it's helpful to keep an eye out for these things. So thank you. And with that said, question that just came in, which is, could you elaborate on the phrase that you use of managing your manager?
Yeah. So I think the image that I had of a manager when I first started was almost like a teacher who had a curriculum that they wanted to walk you through. And like I said, because everyone's career trajectories are different, your manager doesn't know what quote unquote curriculum to walk you through until you let them know where you are. So one part of managing your manager is to make sure that your manager has a good sense of what your goals are, what your strengths are, and what you want to work on. I think that's part number one. And then part number two is also knowing the style of management that you work best in. So some people are very, what am I trying to say? Some people are like, there are different management styles, right? Some people are very micromanagey, right? They want to know everything that you're doing at all times. Some people are very lax and they are okay, checking in on you every 2 months. But you have to know what style you work best in. So if your project is isolated, you really need and you know that you work best when someone's checking in on you every week. You need to ask your manager for that. And or alternatively, tell them that you need to be less isolated, right? And need to work on projects that are going to touch more people. So I think a lot of sort of managing your managers, knowing what to ask for, knowing how to ask for it, and knowing when to ask for it.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Levy is wondering, how do you become a software engineer without a formal education in that field?
Yeah. So thinking about the people that I've worked with who took these paths, there are a couple of different ways. One is just being like so interested in it that they have done so many projects, like their GitHub, the online, there's an online repository that's like the equivalent of, I don't know, Google Docs or Google Drive, right, for your code. And their GitHub repository has got so filled with projects that they've done over time that that's the equivalent of an education, right? And so when someone asks you for your, like, do you know how to code? You have a clear portfolio of things that you can point to and say, like, this is what I've done. So that's one way to get into a software engineering role without a formal software engineering education. But there are also now a lot of like alternative sort of education paths that people can take. So, and actually some people that I worked with in non-technical roles at Google were trying to switch into a technical role at Google, and they were taking things like Lambda School, which is one of these online online like new kind of education models where you go to Lambda School, you don't pay them anything, and then they have sort of a guarantee of a job at the end of Lambda School. And when you get that job, you, for the first year or something, pay 30% of your salary back to Lambda School. I'm making these numbers up, but it's something like this. There's Lambda School. There are also some other, like, a bunch of other coding boot camps that have cropped up. And a lot of, like I said, a lot of the best people that I worked with didn't have like these traditional formal education backgrounds. And so I actually think that like when someone makes that conscious choice to go to Lambda School or to take a coding boot camp or just learn, contribute to GitHub by themselves, they are much more motivated and they like know what they want out of that experience. And so that actually makes them a better software engineer than people who chose to do this path when they were like 16 or 18. So yeah, so those are sort of the three ways, like the GitHub way, the Lambda School / coding bootcamp way. And then I guess like the third way sort of is to like kind of pivot, like join a company, like join a startup, for example, in marketing. And then, just kind of naturally over time, 20% of your time is going to go towards things that aren't marketing in the company. And maybe there's a way of, pivoting while you're there and sort of learning to, maybe you can't like learn to code and start coding all at the same time there, but maybe you like do one of these coding boot camps and then, or, some equivalent of them, and then, pivot to a new role at that startup. So lots of different ways. I think one key sort of pattern that I've seen with all of the people who I know who have switched is having a really solid champion. Like this doesn't have to be someone who codes themselves, but it's someone who keeps you accountable for like continuing to make your way towards that goal. If you're in that marketing gig, maybe it's someone else at the company who who you can ask for help on coding. Or if you're working in a totally different job and you're going to Lambda school, maybe your champion is like your significant other or your best friend who's just checking in on you every week and saying like, do you feel like you have enough time to devote to Lambda school?
Awesome. Yeah, I love the idea of sort of working on that skill, building it as you're sort of working in something that you've already sort of have experience in. So you can sort of do that on the side with someone keeping accountability. So thanks for sort of detailing those different options. I think that's important. Um, and Jennifer is wondering, for you, what was the most difficult part of starting out as a software engineer?
Hmm. I think it's one of those things that I learned the hard way that I touched upon before, which was uh, understanding that not everyone's trajectories are going to be the same. I had a couple of friends who started with me at Google at around the same time. Like, I joined in September. One friend started in July. Some more friends started in like November. And so I had this sort of picture in my head that since we'd all done approximately the same in school, we would all continue to kind of, you know, follow approximately the same line in our jobs as well. But that was not the case at all. Like, one of them ended up getting promoted really fast, for example. Like within less than a year from when we started, one of my friends got promoted. Another one ended up like leaving Google and going somewhere else. I ended up, switching teams a few times, going through like, just it was very different. We were all prioritizing different things in our lives at the time. So the person who got promoted really quickly, for instance, they were prioritizing work above everything else. They wanted to get through their first year, get promoted really quickly, and then step back and start, focusing on other things in their lives. I started and immediately was like, I can't do this. Like the monotony of using one part of my brain for 8 hours in the day and then going home and doing it all again the next day. Like I can't do that. I knew that I needed to like go to work, but then also go teach a class after school or hang out with friends, like just like play board games with friends or play the piano, like practice the piano for a couple of hours. And so I like did not prioritize work above everything else for that first year, which just put us on like it wasn't like either one of those was a better or worse strategy. Like we were both equally as happy, but we just sort of put ourselves on very different trajectories from that decision that we made at the very beginning. And so yeah, that was like the most difficult thing to get my head around, was just like learning to index off of happiness in life and not index off of like, am I getting the best grades? I'm like being hyperbolic, obviously, but just to like kind of bring the point home around, different people are prioritizing different things in life.
Yeah, wow, I love that idea of indexing off of happiness. I think that definitely sort of rings true. I think to a lot of different people, like the different metrics that we're using. So yeah, I'm trying to. There's no real transition to the next question here, but I'm just sort of stuck on that point. So the next question here, though, is from Alina, and that is, how do you evaluate if you're doing well in a job/internship if you can't calibrate with others' progress?
Yeah, great question. So there are definitely some things that um, are more objective markers for how you're doing. That, for example, you would put in like your performance review. So, and everyone for every like reviewer of a performance review, like this is slightly different, right? Every director that I talk to would themselves index off of different signals that they're seeing from people. So take this with a grain of salt. But one way is, the sort of superficial way is like lines of code produced. Again, bad signal to compare yourself to other people, because like some people's projects are going to be really code heavy, other people's projects are going to be like, you know, not that. And so, yeah, so that's one way. Another way is sort of quality and number of design documents that you're writing. Again, this is for performance reviews, and I'm gonna, like, from the performance review angle, and then I'm gonna go back and kind of do this again for like your own internal validation. So in terms of, sorry, just putting my computer on do not disturb. In terms of performance review, so like number of lines of code, number of design docs, and like quality of those design docs. And then it's all about like impact of what you've done. So on like users or latency or like whatever the sort of end goal of your team is, you are going to think about, well, how did you impact that goal? For a backend engineer, those signals are typically like latency and like, wow, Tara, you've been out of a backend engineering role for a couple of months and now you already don't remember what you were doing. Wow, latency. Oh, I guess sort of like for us, for me, for example, I was working on a team that brought free public Wi-Fi to emerging markets. So one really important thing for us was the speed at which we were able to work with a partner. So not only like the read and write latency to our database, but also like the sort of speed at which we were onboarding new partners. That was a big one. And like the number of like access points, the number of routers that we were adding to a network on like a daily or weekly basis. But for other people on the team, their sort of impact metrics were, you know, growing the user base from 10 million daily active users to 20 million daily active users, or I'm making these numbers up, but you know, that could be a metric. So it's about these superficial metrics of like, you know, number of lines of code or design docs written, but it's also more about like, how are you as an individual contributing to the larger goal of the team? And then, so that's sort of what goes in your performance review and how you calibrate yourself. But there's also this like internal thing. So you can be like doing things that are super impactful for your team, but if they're not also aligned with your own personal like strengths or things that you want to develop, then you're not going to be, and again, back to the indexing on happiness thing, like you're not going to be happy, you're not going to feel like you're being valuable to the team. And so I think there's this like pendulum that everyone goes through. Like you start indexing on something like, I don't know, number of lines of code. And then you're like, wait, hold on, I can write a lot of code and not impact end users. Then you go like this other extreme of, well, why don't I just, you know, grow our user base, like, or sort of, you know, grow the number of users who use my feature by 10x. And then you realize like, oh wait, you know, that is using some skills that I'm not super excited to develop. So then you sort of like keep correcting, and eventually you get to this happy middle ground of, you know, you're like writing the amount of code that you want to write, you're using the skills that you want to use, and you contributing and having an impact to the team. And that like happy medium ground is where you eventually want to be.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a really insightful answer, and sort of helps to sort of frame the question, and thinking about like more holistically, and not so much in terms of a metric that might just sort of limit the way you're thinking and like might drive you to be less productive or less happy. So I really like that framework. And with that said, a question sort of on diversity in software engineering. So the question is, at the start of your talk, you mentioned the diversity that exists in engineering. As a white guy who sees mostly other white guys in his computer science classes, what can I do to help create a more diverse / welcoming environment for historically underrepresented groups like women and people of color?
Yeah, great question. I said it's becoming more diverse. I didn't say that it's becoming like it's like reached the point of full diversity. So okay, so what can you do? Number one, I think uh, like computer science has this like really domineering, scary, intense vibe to it from the outside, that people, don't feel super welcome in. And some of that is by design, right? Some of that is about, um, just the fact that while engineering in the real world is very collaborative, engineering in school is pretty isolating. I mean, every program is different, but the program that I went through was, we hardly did any, projects together. You had to work by yourself for most of it. And if you needed help, you had to like go sit in line for 5 hours to get access to a TA who could help you. None of these things are particularly welcoming to people. So I think as much as is possible, trying to either change that environment, or if you don't have access to like changing curriculum, then at least kind of make the physical space that is the computer science building feel more accessible. And then the question comes like, we're remote, how do we make it feel accessible when we're not physically there? Great question. Haven't really had time to think about this. So maybe I'll like get back to you on the Slack channel, but there's got to be a way of doing that. I think number two is a lot about mentorship and like sort of being that person who people can feel safe coming to. I, went through this phase where I was like, I don't want to be a software engineer. Like, this is difficult, right? I don't want to be in this department where I feel like I'm, climbing an uphill battle every day, both socially and in terms of the like isolation that I was feeling in my classes. But I sort of ended up flipping that around. I found that a lot of the isolation came from my inability to be able to talk to some TAs and like talk to friends. And so I ended up being that person who was like, come to me, or like, I'll become a TA and kind of create more of this like, collaborative, friendly environment where people aren't afraid to say like, I don't get that. um, I I remember there's this like particularly powerful moment in the like algorithms class that we took that I took as a junior or senior. And it's like this notoriously difficult class. The professor is brilliant. But you have this feeling that like everyone around you has to be brilliant in order to be in this class. And so there was a moment where the professor asked like, what happens, you all know how software is built, what about the hardware? Like, can anyone tell me about considerations around CPUs and GPUs? And there's this moment where not a single hand in the class went up. And there's sort of this like whispering of like, oh my God, no one knows the answer to this question. Like, it's okay if I raise my hand and like say something stupid, because literally no one knows the answer to this question otherwise. And so just like create like the fact that that only occurred to me when I was a senior means that like there was just like that moment had literally never happened. Like, it was literally never okay before to say that you didn't know the answer to the question. And that was yeah, that's just like not an environment that's like warm and welcoming and friendly. So as much as you can, like teach other people, create that environment. Or if you are a person who works better one-on-one, then be a mentor for someone who is, younger than you or earlier on in the program than you. And you don't have to feel like you have like these grains of wisdom to be a mentor to someone. I think in the beginning, a lot of mentorship is just like showing up and, you know, being like, yeah, just showing up and being a friendly face for someone who, might be walking into a situation where they don't know anyone. I'm sure that there are going to be other things that I'm going to have wanted to talk about, but thank you for asking that question. I think it's like very important to just acknowledge the privilege from which you come. Like for me, that privilege was definitely, I came from the Bay Area, and I had started to program in high school. I took 3 classes. I'd already taken 3 classes, including like the AP and an advanced topics class by the time I got to college, and I still found it difficult. So like you can have all this privilege and still find it difficult. And so imagine what someone who doesn't have any of that, any of that community or prior understanding, imagine how hard it is for them.
Yeah, no, it is a really important question. And there's a question here that kind of follows up to that. And Alina, again, is wondering about your experience as a chapter lead at Google Women in Engineering. Like, what was that experience like? And then again, what would you recommend women can do to feel comfortable in tech roles? So there's any like experience you gained from that, from your time doing that?
Yeah, sure. So um, uh, this was actually, so harking back to something that I said in the presentation of you're never too new to start participating. When I was an intern, saw that there was this like inactive kind of group called Google Women in Engineering. And so I went to one of my friends who was in the program, and I was like, Allison, or she came to me and she was like, Tara, we should do something about this. I don't remember how it happened. But we were like, can we just start emailing this group and like put stuff together? And we started doing it, and no one told us not to. So we like organized, lunches with senior women to come and talk to us. We just did like more of a community building stuff where there was no set agenda, but the agenda was just to get to know more people. And then we also helped sort of put together a summit for interns. Sorry, this was not when we were interns, but later on, like as full-timers, we ended up helping with this summit that really helped us when we were interns. And so, that was sort of how I started, being part of Google Women in Engineering. And then at the end of the summer, we handed the reins off to a full-timer. And by the time we came back as full-timers, she was like, praise, you're back again. Like, let's all be leads together. And so over the 2.5 years that I was lead for Google Women in Engineering, what we did was sort of we had sort of like 4 pillars that we were looking at. The first was, and I'm going to forget these, but like sort of the professional development of women in the workplace. The second was, within the larger context of Google, are there things that we can, advocate for to leadership? The third was like community building within Google. And then the fourth was outreach to the community. And over the 2.5 years, we did a bunch of stuff in each of these categories. So for example, related to professional development, we put on these, summits and like smaller lunches where either someone would come and talk to us, because I think it's like very validating to hear from someone more senior that they went through the same thing and like this is how they got through it. So that was sort of the professional development piece. The advocating on behalf of women for senior leadership, I was less involved in this piece, but people within Google Women in Engineering would sort of naturally like kind of come together and say, you know, um, we want to do XYZ to like respond to a situation or just respond to these thoughts and feelings that we have. So for example, you know, when I was at Google, and maybe I don't want to talk about this because this is a whole can of worms, but when I was at Google, there was an incident where a person or a man like basically published this long article about how women are biologically inferior to men in the space of like computer science and math, and therefore they make worse engineers. And this was, you know, like dealt with on many levels, right? Up to the very top of Google. But as Google Women in Engineering, someone ended up like starting many things happened, like petition happened, a sort of call to allies happened, a sort of training of the allies happened. And this is all something that like kind of happened from the ground up, which was really awesome to see. Yeah, don't want to say too much more about that situation, but it sucked in the moment. But the amazing thing was seeing the response that happened without anyone like starting to protest about it. The situation was just like dealt with. And then afterwards, the community came together and they were like, okay, we need to like be much more explicit about this and, you know, like make it a conscious process to become better allies for not only women, but for all, you know, marginalized communities. And then, so that was the second piece. The third piece was just community building. Like we would, you know, throw fun events, and you wouldn't believe the number of times people came up to us and they were like, I've been at Google for 7 years and I, you know, didn't know any women. Like there were no women on my team, and therefore I didn't know any women until I came to one of these events. And now, lo and behold, you know, I have a friend on my floor that I never would have met had it not been because of like a random ice cream social or like, you know, card making event that we threw. So that was great. And then the fourth piece, it was community outreach. And we did a number of events with schools in East Palo Alto, Oakland, and just like around the Bay Area. And now I think actually this is something that has become much more easy to do remotely. I mean, it's harder to teach remotely, yes, but it is easier to reach more people remotely. And so I'm sure that they're like continuing that endeavor to bring computer science, you know, education to people earlier and mentorship to people earlier.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for speaking on that and your experiences. Definitely really appreciate that and hearing your perspective. Um, there are a few questions here from Alina, and I do want to have them answered, but I want to make sure that we get to everyone's. So I recommend, Alina, if I don't circle back to you, to definitely follow up with Tara on Slack. And let me ask Harold's question, which is, how do you ask the right questions when you're talking to your manager / coworker? So how do you phrase things, I think is sort of the gist of the question.
Interesting. I think, I mean, I don't want to be too prescriptive about this, but in the conversations where you might be having trouble verbalizing a question, it's probably because you have like a more explicit goal that you want to get out of the conversation, or because you don't feel super comfortable having that conversation in the first place. So those are sort of different situations. So let's do the first one first. If there's a goal, I find it really useful to just write stuff down. So before I and again, this is not for like every single conversation that I ever have with someone, but I like to write down, okay, what is the goal of this conversation? What could the person say, and try and anticipate what they'll say, and sort of write down different versions of the question in case there's some miscommunication. Um, that's one piece, and we can go into, I really want to know, I want to get like a specific situation, and then we can like workshop this. But uh, yeah, I mean, I think like, and this goes into the second piece too, of like, do you feel comfortable enough? Do you have the psychological safety with this person to like be vulnerable, or to like potentially ask it wrong and like be able to recover from that? I think it's really important to just build up trust with people so that they know where you're coming from and you know where they're coming from. This is like the part of compassionate communication that I think comes like least easily in a moment where you're struggling with something. And this is where, okay, this is a whole other rant, but first let me answer this part. So if you feel like there is something that you want to ask but you don't know how they're going to react, it probably means that there's some level of psychological safety that is not being met for you. And so then it's about like, is there something that is there, a way of building trust with this person? And maybe it's, less explicit than one-on-one. Maybe it's like your whole team goes and does some sort of like a, true colors assessment together, or like a team building thing together. And then maybe it's easier for you to ask your question. But yes, even if you do have psychological safety with someone, it can still be really hard to remember where they're coming from. And so this is also something that, at least for me, it helps to write it down. Like, one person on my team with whom I had a little bit of tough time talking to initially, I realized it was because we just had different goals, like different motivations for doing things. For example, theirs was typically like they wanted to make the best technical decision. Like they wanted it to be just like a technical thing, like a feat that they could be proud of, that they would, be able to like turn into a teacher and say like, this was like, you know, look at how much I learned. The kind of goal was like, am I doing the right technical like masterpiece? And for me, the goal was not that. The goal was like, am I learning a lot? Is the team doing the right thing? And those two were sometimes in tension with each other. And so for me, when I talked to that person, I needed to like take a minute and be like, okay, their goal is technical mastery. How can I be more understanding and compassionate towards that motivation that they have? And like remind them that that's not necessarily where I'm coming from, and we can meet in the middle. So those are my takes on like the two situations that often lead to like this, discomfort asking questions. But happy to, workshop a more specific scenario if you have one in mind.
Yeah, thank you. I think if you don't mind, I have one more question. And then I think we have a lot of great questions that are sort of remaining that I'm just going to copy over into the Slack, so we're not going too far over here. But I do want to, if you have time, ask one more question, kind of shifting from communication to more of like the coding interview process. And that is, how can we best prepare for a coding focused interview? Are there any tips or tricks from the Google software engineer interview process that you could share?
Yeah. Okay. Here we go. So everyone prepares for technical interviews differently, but in essence, the technical like being really good, and you will get different questions from other people if you ask them this, but different answers from other people if you ask them this. But in my opinion, technical interviews are about building up this map in your head. Okay, you're all maybe familiar with this like hash map situation. Okay, there's like this one to many or many to one. We don't know. I don't remember what it is for me. I think it's like many to many mapping in my head of types of questions to types of solutions. And if you see enough of, for me, okay, for me, if I see enough examples of questions, I start to categorize them and figure out what this map is to types of solutions. Okay, so it's kind of like the way that you prepare for technical interviews is however way you need to build up this map in your head. For some people or for most people rather, that involves doing questions, like looking at, there's this book called Cracking the Coding Interview, which is great, like very comprehensive, and a lot of people that I know use it or used it. Cracking the Coding interview will basically take you through, all of the topics that could be covered in a technical interview. And walk you through sort of a summary, and then they'll have a bunch of practice questions and solutions in the book itself. And so however you're going to be interviewed, so if it's on a whiteboard, I would do it in a notebook. If it's going to be a remote interview, then I would do it in Google Docs or in like Sublime Text, like your favorite editor, and just do a bunch of problems, like force yourself to sit down for like X number of minutes every night that you're preparing for an interview, and practice it as if you were in the moment. So for some people, what they get really stressed about is the syntax. For other people, it's like will my code execute correctly? For other people, they have no idea what to say, how to translate what's happening in their head to talking out loud. So just practice the whole thing. It's like a very weird and uncomfortable feeling to be in a technical interview, but if you do it enough, it starts to get a little easier. The second part, more than just practicing as the interviewee, is to actually practice as an interviewer. So if there are people who are in the grade, below you, or, younger than you are in a program, or even like your peers, it's really helpful to say, hey, I'm going to devote 3 hours of my time to give practice interviews to 3 people. Pick your favorite question. It's kind of a toss-up, the kind of question that you get in a technical interview, but just pick your favorite question. It doesn't really matter what the question is. And see, right? Observe what the other person is doing, and make notes of that in your head of like, oh, this person, is talking a little too much and they, sound a little nervous, or this person, is kind of completely silent. And now I understand from the interviewer's perspective that you really need to have this balance of how much you talk, so that the interviewer is understanding how you solve problems. So that can be a really helpful way to sort of help hone your own interview skills. And then the third part was, Tara, what was the third part? The third part was, I'm not remembering.
It's Friday.
It's fine.
I understand.
Oh yeah. The third part is, I wanted to talk about sort of, I think for me, like I could do all of that, but at the end of the day, it seemed like, after doing a couple technical interviews, it seemed like it was a toss-up between me getting a question that I knew how to do versus me getting a question that was like so inaccessible to me that I was like, oh, I don't even know where to start. Like I would hear the words bit manipulation and my brain would just like shut down. When in reality, a lot of, questions aren't going to be like gotcha questions. If they are, you probably don't want to work with that person, but they typically aren't gotcha questions. Like that bit manipulation question that I got was I'm sure like didn't really have like, maybe you needed to know that like, you were working in binary and you could like shift things left and right. But um the sort of like technical knowledge base isn't going to be so huge. It's more about it's more testing like your ability to problem solve on the fly. Um so just sort of get okay not knowing the answer to the question initially, and like walk through in your mind, like whatever you're doing in your mind to start walking through the question, do that out loud with the interviewer, and the interviewer will like kind of guide you, or they should, if they're good interviewers, they should guide you through a question. Like you should be able to get like a nugget of from a question and kind of flow with that. And if you don't, if something is like such a weird question that you don't know how to answer it, they're probably waiting for you to clarify the question. Like they probably gave you an ambiguous question because they were testing like, are you going to ask me questions? So yeah, so sort of walk through it with the interviewer. And then typically, like, if you feel like a question is too easy, typically the question will get harder and harder as you go. And if you feel like a question is too hard, typically it'll like get easier and easier as you sort of ask clarifying questions. I don't know if that helps at all. It shouldn't, basically, you shouldn't feel like it's a toss up between getting a question that you know how to answer and getting a question that you don't know how to answer. Just like be okay with it being that second category at all times, and know that you have like this toolkit that you've developed over time that will help you in that interview.
Wow, awesome. Tara, thank you so much. I can't believe how much you covered in just over an hour, from representation in STEM to like walking through best practices in a coding interview to dealing with your first managers and communicating with them, to your first kind of 90 days at Google. It's been a really, really, really incredible presentation and Q&A. So thank you. Thanks for sharing your time. We have more questions, which I will make sure to note down and then have, so hopefully you can follow up. But I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your time and like your honest sort of opinions and expertise to the students. I think it's been a really inspiring hour. So thank you.
You're so welcome. And yeah, I'm on the Slack, so follow up if you have questions.
Awesome. Tara, enjoy the rest of your Friday. Thanks so much. And to everyone else, thank you for tuning in on YouTube. We have an awesome schedule of speakers on, and the main sort of topic is breaking into your industry. So we've heard a lot about different industries, from software engineering to marketing, to HR. So this next week is more focused on breaking into those, the interviews, and learning about sort of how to do that. And so I'll project the schedule for next week. Definitely make sure to subscribe on YouTube and follow us on our social media. It's all on xooglerschool.com. With that, enjoy your Friday, and everyone, thanks so much. Goodbye.
Bye.